levels of time. He's a very, very good writer. But I didn't know that he had also actually written about cooking, and this is an extremely funny book. He calls himself the pedant, and he says the pedant in the kitchen is not concerned whether cooking is a science or an art. He will settle for it being a craft, like woodwork or home welding. Nor is he a competitive cook. It surprised him to discover that gardening, for all its air of prelapsarian serenity, is furiously competitive, frequently indulged in by the envious, the deceitful, and the quietly criminal. And I'm talking to you, the members of my garden club who are here. Doubtless there are competitive cooks, but the pedant is not one of them. He just wants to cook tasty, nutritious food. He just wants not to poison his friends. He just wants to slowly expand his repertoire. Ah, the pathos of those justs. With these craftsman's ambitions, he is never going to invent his own dishes. He might occasionally act or engage in some minor act of disobedience, such as increasing the quantity of his favorite ingredient, but he is, in essence, a recipe-bound drudge, a careful follower of the words of others. He approaches a new recipe, however straightforward, with old anxieties. Words flash at him like stop signs. Is this recipe framed in this imprecise way because there's a happy latitude, or rather a scary freedom for interpretation, or because the writer isn't capable of expressing him or herself more accurately? It starts with simple words. How big is a lump? How voluminous is a slug or a gout? When does a drizzle become rain? Is a cup a rough and ready generic term or a precise American measure? Why tell us to add a wine glass of something when wine glasses vary so much in size? And research has shown that they have doubled in size over the last century. He says, my wrath is also frequently turned against the cookbooks on which I rely so heavily. The self-taught, anxious, page-scowling domestic cook is about as pedantic as you can get. But then why should a cookbook be less precise than a manual of surgery? Always assuming, as one nervously does, that manuals of surgery are indeed precise. Perhaps some of them sound like cookbooks, and this is where he's taking aim at our Jamie. Sling a gout of anaesthetic down the tube, hack a chunk off the patient, watch the blood drizzle, have a beer with your mates, sew up the cavity. Why should a word in a recipe be less important than a word in a novel? One can lead to physical indigestion, the other to mental. And he loves River Cafe blue, River Cafe yellow and green. He says he uses blue and green constantly. They've taught me more lessons than most. One of the lessons is that the relationship between professional and domestic cook has similarities to a sexual encounter. One party is normally more experienced than the other, and the other party should have the right at any moment to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I am not going to debone a chicken. The Herald reviewer said Barnes puts almost as much elegance and thought into this series of short essays as he does into his fiction. Fizzing with decades of pent-up frustration and creative rebellion, this is a tiny masterpiece of observational wit. Highly recommended. Every cook should own it. Still on the theme of food is a book that I found some years ago by Lizzie called Curry, A Tale of Cooks and Conquerors. She's also written a book called A Taste of Empire, and she's written a number of books, in fact, looking at how food has changed the world and how food underlay a lot of the British Empire expansion, for trade. She also looked at food during the war. Interestingly enough, the British population was the healthiest they'd ever been in rationing that continued for 10 years after the Second World War. Now, this book tells the history of India and its rulers through their food. And it follows the story of curry as it spreads from the courts of Delhi to Birmingham. It's really the product of India's long history of invasion. The Mughal conquerors came down from Persia to northern India, and in the south you have the Portuguese spice merchants introducing vinegar marinades and the chilies that they had recently discovered in the New World. The British soon followed with their passion for roast meat accompanied by cauliflower and beans. When these new ingredients were mixed with native spices, they produced those distinctively Indian dishes. William Dalrymple, whom I mentioned on Tuesday, describes the book as scholarly, accessible, and above all, utterly original. It's one of the hottest and most mouth-watering books of non-fiction about India to appear for many years. Now, what is interesting is that curry has become one of the most internationalized foods on this planet. But Lizzie Collingham debunks the myth that cuisine remains unchanged for years. She points out that it's constantly changing. And what we think of as a traditional cuisine is in fact subject to many influences over the years. So, for example, when we think of Indian cuisine, we think of curry, hot food, but in fact chili peppers, tomatoes, potatoes, and tea were all imports into India. What could be more Indian than chilies? But actually it was the Portuguese, when they arrived in Goa at the beginning of the 15th century, who brought with them the New World spice that Columbus had called the pepper of the Indies. Before this, the heat in Indian dishes had come from a red pepper known as the long pepper, or from the black pepper known to the west. The tomato was eaten by the Aztecs as early as 700 AD and called tomatal. That was its name in Nahuatl, and it wasn't grown in Britain until the 1590s, and people were suspicious of it for a good couple of centuries because they thought it was poisonous. In the early 16th century, the Spanish conquistadors returning from expeditions in Mexico and other parts of Mesoamerica are thought to have introduced the seeds to southern Europe. And the Indian historian Kate McCallum suggests as late as 1850 for the date of its possible introduction into India. And curry, strictly speaking, is not Indian at all. It's a British invention. From the Portuguese, the early British traders learnt to apply the words caril or curry incorrectly to sauces made from butter, crushed nuts, spices and fruits that were then poured over rice. In various southern Indian languages, caril or curry referred to spices for seasoning or to dishes of sautéed vegetables or meat. And eventually the word evolved into a catch-all, and curry became not just a term that the British used to describe an unfamiliar set of Indian stews, but a dish in its own right, created for the British in India. The same with mulligatawny, the British invention. And Lizzie Collingham said, in their clueless search for palatable food, the British managed to invent curry powder, Worcestershire sauce, and ketchup, which was made from mushrooms until tomatoes became popular in the 19th century. Most impressively, they also turned India, where scarcely a cup of tea was drunk before 1900, into a nation of avid tea drinkers. As Indians and their curries made their way from the West Indies to South Africa to the Pacific Islands, and ironically they took tomatoes and peppers back with them in their dishes, the culinary give and take continued. And Miss Collingham turns up all sorts of cultural odds and ends, like the Mexican Hindu cuisine that appeared in California in the early 20th century, when Punjabi labourers integrated jalapeno peppers and tortillas into their native dishes. The book is packed with fascinating facts, anecdotes, analysis, and even some recipes, which I cook from now. It's thoroughly absorbing and another must-have for any cook or non-cook. What I want for next Christmas is my own personal little spice boy sitting in a corner of the kitchen grinding fresh spices for me. Then, some of you may have read this. This is Atul Ga Being, who is a writer that I followed for some time. He has written many articles for The New Yorker, I'd say over the last 15 years, and he's written a number of books. Complications, and one that I've used in training courses on business, the Checklist Manifesto, aimed at reducing mortality in surgical operations. And the one I'm going to talk about today is called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. He's a practicing surgeon in general and endocrine surgery at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. And he's a professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and the professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School. He also is the chair of a couple of non-profit companies looking at reducing deaths in surgery globally. And in 2014, the BBC asked him to present the Wreath Lecturers, because what he often writes about are the broader dimensions of medicine, or the ethical dilemmas. His latest book, Being Mortal, illustrates the two dilemmas about death and aging that we in the West are really only starting to grapple with. The first is how we plan to care for people and ourselves, who through our bodies, though our bodies and minds are weakening, are granted great longevity. The second dilemma is how we manage the body's decline when a cure is out of reach. And he's written an impassioned, broad-ranging, and deeply personal exploration of both. The first dilemma really concerns the tremendous success of modern healthcare. The infections that once killed most of us have been subdued, and the diseases that even a few decades ago killed us in our 60s and 70s, cancer, heart disease, stroke, and emphysema, are increasingly treatable. It's a paradox that innovation-driven, individual-oriented societies have evolved medical technologies and therapeutics so advanced that we can keep people alive for longer than ever. But those same societies are not set up to care for people who become dependent in old age, nor are people themselves anticipating a change in their health. When you're healthy and fit, you never think that you could become demented or dependent on the care of others. And so it's partly a lack of preparation that he takes aim at. And he also says, really, when you look at nursing homes in America, they are not attractive alternatives. They're usually run for the convenience of staff rather than for the emotional and social well-being of the patients. Things like pets, which have been shown to improve emotional health and help people live longer, are usually banned in retirement villages, nursing homes, and so on. He said that is not a decision in the interests of the patient. And he points out that an obsession with risk is stultifying the lives of the most valuable in the society. Children are allowed to play on climbing frames, but we refuse to allow any kind of risk for the aged. If the first half of his book concerns preparing for old age and how we can age with self-respect, The second half concerns palliative care and how we can die with grace and without excessive medical interventions at the end. He points out that what is needed is a discussion between doctor and patient, not about the quantity of life, but about the quality of life that is important to the patient. Does the patient simply want to be able to live until the wedding of a child? What constitutes quality of life for them? Being able to eat ice cream, being able to read. I can tell you now that when I can no longer read, you just pull the plug. Okay? That is the last bit of quality of life for me. But he says these conversations are not being held. Helping people through a good death is increasingly acknowledged to be as important as helping them flourish while alive. And you need to have a discussion about to what extent you want medical interventions, what sort of medical interventions you want. And he also points out that both parties are often uncomfortable with discussing difficult topics, and so it's just easier to avoid it altogether. The message resounding through Being Mortal is that our lives have narrative. We all want to be the author of our own stories, and in stories, endings matter. I recommend everything he's written in book form and in the New Yorker. Highly recommended. Related to this, and I sort of hesitated about including it, and I thought actually this is a really important book. It's called Share the Care by Cappy, Capossela and Sheila Warnock, who point out that whether you're prepared for it or not, the chances are that you are going to take on the role of caregiver when a family member or a friend is affected by a serious illness or injury. And as you'll soon discover, the range of tasks and responsibilities will range from major ones, checking someone into hospital, taking them to the doctor, sorting out medical aid, paying bills, keeping track of medications, to the minor, such as walking the dog, preparing a meal, watering plants, taking out the dustbins, or just drawing cash for them because they can't get to the cash dispenser. If you want to help, but you're feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities, this book offers a solution as to how the care can be shared among a group of people, with each person taking on a different role so that one person is not overburdened. And it's a particularly good solution for people who live on their own. It started when 12 people, including the two authors, got together to help their terminally ill friend, Susan, and stayed together caring for her for 3.5 years until her death. Cappy, who started out as a frightened first-time caregiver, and Sheila, a burnt-out veteran caregiver, have documented for other people the systems that they developed during that period. The book is immensely practical, describes how to form a group, how to establish how much each person is able to take on, how to avoid burnout, how to communicate, how to coordinate and allocate care on a weekly basis. They include guidelines, worksheets, checklists of everything that could possibly relieve a patient from worry and caregivers from freedom and guilt. And they make the point that even when there's a primary caregiver, which is often a child or a spouse, they can well do with assistance. And I'd love to see the system spreading through Cape Town. I have my own end in mind. Cappy writes, in those 3.5 years, I learnt a lot about sickness and dying, but that was nothing compared to what I learnt about living. I learnt what it was to put yourself in someone else's place. I learned how to stop doing and just be. I learned that by accepting limitations, life becomes a richer, deeper experience. I learned people can be healed even if they're not cured. Mostly, I learned about the special power of a group, and I found bonds of friendship and love that are more powerful than disease and stronger than fear. I'm not the person I was 5 years ago. It's highly recommended. I put it in my book club, and it so impressed everyone over 50, that they bought multiple copies to give to their friends. So I hope it is a concept that spreads. Next book is Mary Roach, Grunt. As I said last year, I came across a review of Mary Roach's book, Stiff, The Curious Lives of Human Cadavers in the New Scientist. I bought it and I became a fan for life. I now own every one of her books and I can't wait for the next one. She's just wonderful. She's actually a serious science writer who cannot help being attracted to the arcane and the ridiculous and the world of scientists, and she has a fabulous sense of humour. She has an intense sense of curiosity. She is genuinely interested in really arcane fields of search. There's her first book, Stiff. Her last one was Bonk, in the field of sex research, and I just guffawed my way through it. She wrote Gulp, looking at the research that's being done into the microbiome. There's a chapter on Elvis Presley. I mentioned this in the winter school. Elvis Presley had a megacolon and he died on the loo. And she calls that chapter, I'm all stopped up. But she actually goes to visit his GP, his personal doctor. It's riveting. Anyway, Grunt is about the curiousness of humans at war. And she says in the introduction, I'm interested in the parts that no one makes movies about, not the killing, but the keeping alive. And she focuses on what she calls the quiet, esoteric battles with the less considered adversaries: exhaustion, heat, noise, diarrhea, shock, bacteria, panic, and ducks. Now, this was a New York Times bestseller. She dodges hostile fire with the US Marine Corps paintball team as part of a study on hearing loss and survivability in combat. Now, hearing loss is one of those great unmentionables among soldiers. Whoever heard of a Marine wearing a hearing aid? If they admit to hearing loss, they get taken off the missions out of the Marines, so none of them will admit to it. But it's a real problem because they can't hear commands in the field when their mortars going off, rifles being fired, and so on. So there's a lot of research going into the real problem of hearing loss among the infantry. It's about 60%, apparently. One of the things that they've devised is something called T-caps, which amplifies quiet sounds and it reduces loud ones. When the Navy SEALs stormed Osama bin Laden's compound, they were wearing T-caps. And President Obama and Hillary Clinton were able to listen in on the instructions from the White House, thousands of miles away. She visits the fashion design studio of US Army Natick labs, and she learns why a zipper is a problem for a sniper. They spend so much time lying on their stomachs that dirt and mud get stuck in the zipper and it jams. Research on clothing shows that silk underwear is the best kind of underwear to have. If you're wounded, it's strong and it won't end up embedded in your flesh. She visits a repurposed movie studio where amputee actors help prepare Marine Corps medics for the shock and gore of combat wounds. In East Africa, we learn how diarrhea can be a threat to national security in a chapter that she calls Leaky Seals. It was estimated that in Iraq, 77% of combatants came down with diarrhea. In Afghanistan, it was 54%, and it's a major issue for the army. She stays up all night with the crew tending the missiles on the nuclear submarine USS Tennessee. And the Navy acknowledges that in the submarines their greatest problem is sleep deprivation, which leads to cognitive impairment. It's partly the way the shifts are organized, and it's partly the way noise is transmitted around the submarine, the hollow clanging off the walls. But the effect of the cognitive impairment is the effect of putting a crew that it's the equivalent of having drunk 6 whiskies, and you're putting these cognitively impaired men in charge of nuclear missiles. So they're trying all sorts of things. They're looking into all kinds of sleep research to try to work out how they can solve the problem. The growth in the use of IEDs means that more blasts are coming from below. You're seeing less of the traditional shot into the chest. So they're now having to deal with more abdominal and groin wounds. And because the methods of extracting soldiers from the field have improved, you're looking at more of them surviving, whereas in the past they didn't. So she visits the J. Walter Reed Military Hospital to see what is being done. You can refashion a urethra from cheek skin. You can build a new penis from forearm skin. You can transplant a penis from a cadaver. And she says the resulting neopenis is impressively natural looking. The photographs on the surgeon's phone could be mistaken for Anthony Weiner-style selfies. There's a chapter on the post-mortems done on young soldiers that help improve medical care in the field. And one of the things they realized was that so many soldiers were doing weights as a way of passing time, because there are long periods of boredom in war, that they were much more buffed up, and the needles that were being issued were not long enough to get through the bulked up muscle. So one of the lessons was to supply longer needles for use in the field on the buffed up soldiers. As in all her books, Grunt's footnotes are as entertaining as informative as the text. In one example, while discussing the use of maggots to heal infection, Roach helpfully provides the Medicare reimbursement code for maggot therapy. I can't recommend her highly enough for an entertaining and exceptionally fascinating read. John Steer is a great fan. And one of the problems she mentions as well is the weight of the equipment that the soldiers are having to carry. Soldiers and Marines in Iraq and Afghanistan routinely carry between 27 and 45 kilograms of gear. And they're finding that young soldiers are coming in with chronic pain, arthritis, and bone spurs from carrying such heavy loads. I can't imagine it. I think the most I've ever carried was 18 kilograms, and I could hardly walk, let alone balance on one foot. And in some cases, it's up to 75 kilograms of gear. So how you fight with your own weight on your back, just don't know. And this was an illustration of what a soldier carries in the war. So they're looking at more lightweight material all the time, and it has to be material that won't catch fire. 5 seconds is all you need to stop a soldier from dying of burns. That's a similar nuclear submarine to the one that she got. She has an amazing ability to talk her way into the most top secret places. She's hysterical. Okay, this book, Evan McGorman, How to Join the French Foreign Legion and What to Expect When You Get There. Now, if you are looking for a second career, I would highly recommend this book. I came across the book by accident on a friend's Kindle, and I'm slightly abashed to say that I was riveted. It was a mixture of fascination with the the history, or at what they accomplish, an absolute horror that anyone could romanticize war, enough to want to join the French Foreign Legion, which is the most elite fighting unit in the world. And also go through that period of training to subject themselves to that kind of discipline. Anyway, in 1983, Evan McGorman read a magazine article about the French Foreign Legion and was amazed to discover it still existed. For the next 6 years, he was consumed by the romantic notion of running away to join it. Most of them do. Which he finally did after serving 4 years in the Canadian Army. At the age of 22, he went to France, where he signed on for a 5-year stint with the Legion. He says, "First let me say I would not recommend joining the French Foreign Legion to anyone." And part of what fascinated me about the book was the mixture of pride he had in having survived the 5 years. It's like an extreme test of manhood. And his dislike of the sort of the petty bureaucracy that went on and some of the mindless restrictions. But he goes to tell people what to expect. First of all, you have to actually go to France to enlist. You can't enlist online. They have various recruitment centres. And when you do enlist, you sign up for 5 years. Neil Tweedy in the Telegraph notes that as every fan of Beau Geste, March or Die, or Carry On, Follow That Camel knows, the Legion is an elite fighting force, drawing its men, no women allowed, from all corners of the world, and touched by glamour. Formed in 1831 by Louis Philippe to enforce French rule in newly acquired Algeria, it developed into a collective exercise in convenient amnesia, acquiring a reputation as a haven for cutthroats, crooks, and sundry fugitives from justice. Few questions were asked of new recruits, making it an ideal repository for the scum of the earth. And with the scum came the romantics, men searching for a way to dull the pain of doomed love, or avoid alimony or maintenance. France's colonial empire may have disappeared, apart from the odd outpost, but the Legion lives on, almost 7,700 men in it. While the Frenchmen make up most of the officer corps, the enlisted men are drawn predominantly from outside France. He says now aspiring recruits are subject to detailed background checks via Interpol. We don't accept the hardened criminals anymore, the murderers or the rapists, says Captain Samir Beni-Krelev, so this makes our job easier. However, when you read Evan McGorman, and he says when you take a shower, you put your money in a waterproof container inside your mouth, because if you leave it in your clothes, even on the bench, it'll be stolen, you realize all they do are keeping out the hardened criminals. The petty thieves are still there. Petty criminals, they are a tough, hard bunch. All recruits must assume a new name on joining. This is because some recruits do indeed want a new start and a new identity, and it's fairer to make all new legionnaires undergo the same process. Soldiers can revert to their real identities after a year. And there's some 140 nationalities represented in the Legion. So, what does the Legion give the lucky entrant? A hard time, mainly. Before being awarded the Cappy Blanc, this one, the famed white cap of the Legion, recruits must endure a severe training regime that can involve punching and kicking. All recruits have to speak in French, even if they can't, and they're assigned a French-speaking buddy to ensure that they carry out instructions. They can't marry, own a car, or operate a bank account for the 5 years of their contract. The Legion might operate a bank account for them. Even swearing must be in French, and there's a lot of that. New recruits are paid reasonably and get a shiny new rifle, which they are supposed never to leave on the battlefield. One practice popular in the main French army at certain times, surrendering, is not encouraged in the Legion, members of whom are routinely expected to fight to the death. And in their museum is the wooden hand of the colonel who commanded a Mexican outpost where the entire Legion ended up dying. But this wooden hand is still revered as the mark, the symbol of courage of the leader. The good news is the wine. The Legion has its own vineyards in Provence, which provide the main ingredient for the regimental get-togethers. And after 3 years' service, a legionnaire may apply for French citizenship. There's a quicker, more painful way. A soldier wounded in battle may apply for citizenship under a provision known as Français par le sang versé, French by spilled blood. Want a new passport? You know where to go. The next is an absolutely brilliant book by Svetlana Alexievich called Chernobyl Prayer, which won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1915. I initially avoided reading it because I didn't want to read gloom and doom, but when I did eventually read it, I found it the most extraordinary book, an affirming book of love, of dark humor, and absolutely horrifying as well, of human ineptitude, ignorance, and denial. It's a gripping read. The Swedish Academy said it honoured the 67-year-old for her polyphonic writings, a monument to suffering and courage in our time. What she did was to interview hundreds of survivors, or thousands of survivors, and she takes the transcripts of the interviews and leaves them as a voice. So she'll have sort of 5 voices about the cleanup operation, and then she provides a little bit of linking text. So what comes through very strongly are the personalities of the people who were involved. On the 26th of April, 1986, a series of explosions shook the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. This is reactor 4. It's a photograph taken soon after the event. Radiation escaped to contaminate the land and poison the people for years to come. It's going to leave the area radioactive for 48,000 years. Officials did nothing for 5 days. And then they sent in 300 troops from the army with inadequate protection. This shows you where Chernobyl is. The radiation drifted across Europe, and these are the areas that the bright red are highly radioactive, but most of the red and the pink are still closed off to people. But unbelievably, there is a nascent tourism industry, kind of adventure tourism, people being taken into this radioactive area. This is the army and their equipment that was sent in to clean up. They sent in, as I said, 300,000 soldiers, helicopter pilots, clean-up people. The helicopter pilots and what they called the liquidators who were there to remove the radiation, they gave them protective aprons, but actually the radiation was coming up from below. So their genitals and their abdomens were not protected. This is a photograph of a school as it was and as it is now. I mean, one of the ironies, the author notes, is that the place has returned to nature, except it's nature that's gone mutant. There's gigantism among the animals, among the vegetation. She interviews cleanup workers, residents, firefighters, resettlers, widows, orphans, Returnees, unbelievably, this woman is one of 4 people who insisted on returning to her home. She interviews a helicopter pilot who says, "I'm a military man. My duty is to do what I'm ordered. I took an oath, but that's not all. There's also the heroic urge. They'd nurtured it, sown it in our minds at school, at home." And this is one of the interesting things that comes across in the book, is the sort of Russian psyche, particularly among the cleanup workers, of extraordinary heroism. They believed it was their duty to go in there, even though they were likely to die. She talks to the mother of a severely damaged child. This is a 2-year-old who has tumours. She has a tumour on her wrist, which has been cut out, which is why it's bandaged. And she's not likely to survive. Looters go into the area and steal contaminated goods and then steal them in the local markets. So the radiation is creeping out. She interviews a doctor, a radiologist, chemical engineer, the former chief engineer of the Institute of Atomic Energy. There was no nuclear physicist in charge of the plant. An engineer said he witnessed the building of it and he was appalled at the way bribes were given and taken to substitute inferior materials. As Alan Shepard said, "It's a very sobering feeling to be up in space and realize that one's safety factor was determined by the lowest bidder on a government contract." When the plant exploded and the wind nudged a radioactive cloud over the whole country, the director of Belarus's Institute for Nuclear Energy, Vasily Nestorenko, rushed to party offices in Minsk, begging officials to initiate iodine distribution. The city had 700 kilograms of iodine concentrate in store in case of a Cold War attack. He describes a conspiracy of ignorance and obedience, and little has changed. The secretaries were instructed to refuse him admission. They let him in when he held his dosimeter up to their thyroid glands and the machine clattered. Then they let him in and he was sacked. She crafts their voices into a haunting polyphonic oral history of fear, anger and uncertainty, but also dark humour and love. Julian Barnes described it as a collage of oral testimony that turns into the psychobiography of a nation not shown on any map. The book leaves radiation burns on the brain. I think it's a book that should be read by every thinking adult. It doesn't comment on the pros and cons of nuclear energy, but it does show the devastating consequences of human fallibility, error and frailty. And our technology is run by humans. Think of that wrench that was dropped into the Coburg works a few years ago and caused power outages. It's the humans that cause the problem, not the technology. Anyway, I would highly recommend it. This last slide is a concrete roof that very belatedly they've built over the reactor to try to contain the radiation. Now, slightly different. Sid Marty, the Black Grizzly of Whiskey Creek. It won the grand prize of the Banff Mountain Book Festival in 2008 and was a finalist in the Canadian Governor-General's Awards. It's a gripping tale, objectively told, with a very dry Canadian humour and wit. You have to like an author who comments, "She's the kind of wife her husband spends a lot of time admiring." I couldn't put it down the first time I read it, nor the second time a couple of months ago when I was rereading it for this course. Now, in the late 1970s, the distance between bears and humans in the tourist mountain town of Banff in Alberta had become